was always painting.
Yeah, you got those notes here, I know.
No, wasn't it with Dr. Rona? It was a
Well, we
rare
don't
surgery?
tell them twice.
No, but you didn't say what it was.
Well, yeah.
Wasn't removed her spleen, and it was something that you one of the first in the.
Well, yeah,
History.
she had like a 2% chance of surviving that surgery back at that time. And it was Dr. Rowan, I think I told him that.
Yeah, Dr. Roan, but you didn't say what it was. It was the spleen. was
Now that's
removed.
common everyday occurrence.
Yeah, every day, but then it wasn't. To remove the spleen, and it was one of the first.
Are we on now?
We are, but no, you're fine.
No, I just, interesting events. Well, let me just tell you a couple dad and mom things. I told you that we get together with the aunts and their families for special events, and then my mom, this one time, she was bringing pumpkin pie. And in the old car, see a 38 Chevy, there's a little shelf up in the behind the back seat. Well, when we got to Aunt Minda's and we got in the car, Mom was going to take her pie and she couldn't find it. She looked on the seat, it wasn't there neither. She got out of the car, here it was in the back of her coat. So anyway, yeah, that was interesting. Dad, I remember this one time, he had a bad cough, and he got up and he was going to get some cough medicine, and they had the dresser over in the corner of their bedroom, and Dad goes over there, and he didn't want to wake Mom up, so he thought he'd take this in the dark. Well, he forgot he also had the liniment bottle over there, so instead of taking cough syrup, he took liniment. And that was pretty exciting. And then, of course, when they go out insuring, you know, these farmers and others would have dogs sometimes. And some of them weren't too friendly. Well, he had a dream one night and the dogs were chasing him. And he was kicking at the dogs, and he kicked so hard he flew right out of bed. Landed on the floor. And then, of course, yeah, Mom liked to have things painted and repainted. So, and Dad was a painter. He done that. You know, talked about the little jobs he would do here and there. One of them was painting. He painted buildings and he painted for people. And my mother, she would paint, get some rocks and paint border rocks around the lawn. But if you ever go by, I said County 4 down here, and you go past Elmers, and then not the first place, but the second place past, and on the south side of the road, that barn there used to be owned by Guthrie Larson. I remember my dad, he took that job on painting. Well, they had to have the peak that had to be painted underneath. So Dad, he pulled himself up in the swing ropes or whatever, and so he hung in the ropes and painted that peak. He didn't mind heights at all. Yeah. Interesting things. But it's
How about your early relationship with Orville, with Brother Orville? What was that like?
oh, we always had a good relationship. Yeah. Never had a crossword between us that I can ever remember. Not at all. He was an easy brother to get along with, that's for sure. But of course, living in Fergus Falls and having the kind of work we had, you know, it was like a 24/7 kind of a thing, and we basically rarely ever took a vacation because the time I talked about going to California, that was before I ever got in. I was still working for pennies at that time, full time. And so we didn't get down here for all the family events, you know. But they came up once in a while, and we had a lake place, and they'd come and visit us. In the summertime, we'd move out there. I remember Orville and Norma coming up there, and the kids were a little older, and again, I remember Alan, he was running down the dock. He must have been about 4 years old at that time, so it was only a couple, 3 years after, you know, the Sauk Center event where they were down and visited where I took some movies. But I'll never forget, Alan was out there on the dock and he got too close to the edge and he fell in. He went in, and it was pretty shallow, you know. We had a long dock. I had a 50-foot dock. And he came out, and I never forget, he says, I drowned. Yeah. Every once in a while, as you think back, you think of some of those things. And they seem like yesterday, and it's 60 years ago. 50, 60 years ago.
What kind of games? I mean, doesn't seem like there was probably a lot of time for games as a kid. Yeah, but what?
Oh, we play outdoor kinds of things that I remember. Like I said, we'd play football with the four of us, and usually was Myron and I were one team, and Gary and Jerome on the other one, and then we'd have running games and jumping games. And I remember one time we're having a football game over where Elner lives now, and there were probably about 10, 12 of us then. And I was thinking about Orville. He was a good runner too. And of course, I was quarterbacking, I guess, and I threw a ball toward Orville, and he went up and grabbed that with one hand and brought it down. I thought, wow, that was pretty good. I mean, doesn't mean much to anyone, but I still remember it. Lauren, of course, was the speedster in the family. He could run like a deer, but a lot of times we'd have these races at the 4th of July and stuff, and we'd all three race, and it used to be Lauren would come in first, and I'd be second, Orville third. So we liked to run, compete, play ball. Although basketball wasn't around much at that time for us. But I know they did in later years when Lauren Elner lived over in the Ingleson place. I know they had the Haymaw, and they had a basket up there and would play basketball. But we weren't around very often for those occasions.
What was community like with the groups of families? Probably a lot more smaller farms. What do you remember about that?
Well, I remember of course, back in the days, like you say, when there were more farms or people were more diversified in their farming, you know, they'd have a few hogs and a few chickens, and everybody had milk cows, and so we didn't have the milk plants, for example, back at that time, like they do now. We'd separate the milk. We end up with milk and cream, and then we'd have to keep the cream in cream coolers. And then, I don't know, a couple times a week at least, they'd haul the cream to the creamery. But what I wanted to get at was that farmers would go together. You know, one would just haul his cream to the creamery. So we had, for example, in our creamer out there, we had Clarence Flan, Emma Wold, Mabel Swanson, or the Whitsos. Her dad lived with them. John Langley and our place, and whoever week it was, they'd go around and pick up their cream then and haul it to the creamery, Little Sauk. And then these people, if they wanted something, they would send a slip along, and they'd stop at the store and maybe bring them some groceries back, or, you know, pick up butter for them at the creamery and stuff like that. So the other thing was, we didn't have combining back in those early days, so everybody thrashed. So all the grain was harvested with a grain binder, and all the grain was shocked, and then after that was all done, then they'd start with the thrashing, and they'd have a thrash machine would come around, and they'd come to our place, for example, and they'd thrash for a day or whatever, get the thrashing done, and then they'd go over to Clarence Flan, or they'd go to, one of the other places, and they'd each furnish a team. So I ran a bundle team when I was younger, and of course my brothers would have too. We'd go to the neighbor and help him, and then they'd come and help us. We'd go to the other neighbor. Done the same thing with silo filling, for example. It was hard work. I was 13 years old, and I remember this one fall, and we had to do silo filling. Well, my mother had, it probably was, yeah, it would have been the fall of '54, I suppose. So I would have been almost 14. But the neighbors came over, and they were gonna, one of the neighbors was Harold Overbig, actually, was gonna fill a silo, and they needed someone, they needed another team, so wondered if someone, it's just Dad and Lauren and I at that time at home. So I was the only one available, and they were taking Mom to the cities for a checkup or something, and Lauren was gonna do the driving. Dad went along, so already had the job of milking all the cows by hand, myself, and then of course separating and all that. Then I done that in the morning, went over to Overbig's, and we filled their silo, went up to Sunberg's, who lived across the road and up by Maple Lake, and we filled their silo. Then I came back and was still light out, and I remember having to pick corn for the hogs out in the cornfield, then go home and milk all those cows again and separate. That's a pretty good day's work for a 13-year-old.
So at when you were younger, there were fewer animals, but as you got
We
older,
never had a whole lot. My dad never did have a milk machine. I could almost see the cows now that were there for several years, so I was around. We'd have probably, 13, 14 cows. And when it was Orville and Lauren and I, we'd each have maybe 4 cows apiece that we would have to milk. My dad, after he got ulcers, he didn't do much in regard to those kinds of things. And of course, when Orville went to work in the city, so it was just Lauren and I and doing the farming. So we worked hard. We didn't only farm our own farm, but I had an uncle who had a place down by Round Prairie, and I remember we were down there and we farmed that also, and they bought what we call the 40, which is up toward Maple Lake, so we'd have that also. And in the early years we farmed the horses, until about 43 or whatever, they got their first tractor, they got their first new John Deere B. And otherwise it was with the horses. We'd plow with the horses and drag with the horses, the diggers. And I know I was, not that big even when I was at 13 years old. 12, 13, I was harnessing the horses, and those pretty good sized horses. Just to get the harness up there and get it on was hard work. And then we'd have the occasional runaway with the horses, I had a couple of those myself. I know Orville and Lauren both had runaways more than once. So you put up with that stuff too. One time I was working for Gerhard Sampson. I was about maybe 14 years old at that time, and we were putting up hay. And we used what they called a buck rake, and to rake the hay together. And I was raking with the horses, and I dropped one of the reins, and it was down between the horses, and I started going up there to get that rein, and the horses got scared and they took off, and I was out there between the horses. And I had heard all the horror stories about people falling into a rake, and that was the end of them. So I sat down on the tongue of the rake, put my feet between the horse's legs, the one horse's leg, and I held onto the harness, and we had one rein, so we kept going around and around in circles until we finally got him stopped. So it was a dangerous proposition. And of course, Gerhard then and his brother Joseph, they were overstacking hay. I'd buck the hay up there with the rake, and so they saw what happened, so they came over and helped get the horse to stop too. So, farming was not easy. And then of course when you're a farmer, you had milk cows. They didn't take the day off. You could have a busy day, or you could have a good day and a relaxing day, a Sunday or whatever, and you'd always have to go home and milk those cows. And I remember both Orville and Lauren saying, well, when we get older, we have our own place, so we're not going to have milk cows. Well, then they discovered that they couldn't really make it without the milk cows. They needed that steady income. So they did milk cows. And of course Sheldon's still milking over there, and that farm I think has always had milk cows on it.
Going back to the thrashing party. Tell me what that was like. What was the
Well, in the early years, the earliest years, we used to stack the grain up by the barn or by the buildings. We'd have grain stacks there, and then when it came time to thrash, they'd pull. One of the neighbors had a thrash machine. The first one I remember, the first couple 3 years was they had what they call the separator, was the thrasher, and then they ran it with a steam engine. So I remember coming up, pulling up, and they set up between the grain stacks. They'd have they had the steamer there. Of course, they had to be careful because that was fired with wood, so you had sparks in that. So it was not unheard of that somebody had caught a spark in their grain stacks or something, but I never saw it happen. But anyway, they would have the steam engine there, and somebody'd have to keep firing that, so they kept the steam up, and then later, I also remember when they went to shock thrashing, and that's when they had to have the teams. They'd go together, a half a dozen of them, and each furnish a team, and then they'd just go out and load a wagon of grain shocks and bring it up to the trash machine, unload it, and then the next one would be ready behind them. And they had, they'd pitch in from both sides basically, and so you'd have two unloading at the same time. Well, I ran my first team in shock thrashing when I was 13 years old. And I had to keep up with those men, and I was not a very big guy. In fact, when I was married, I only weighed 135 pounds, so you can imagine. That was a lot earlier than that. But we managed to hang in there. Later ran then a team a couple of years for Gerhard Sampson for his thrashing. We'd come to the farm, and there was one thing we'd always look forward to was we had good meals. The women would go all out to provide good food for us, and we'd always get our first lunch in the morning, and we could see the women coming down from the house headed for the thrash machine, and they'd have their dishpan with a white towel over it, and they'd have sandwiches and cookies and cake and beverage. And then dinner was the big meal, and then we'd get another meal after lunch in the afternoon, and every place we went to we had the same format for thrashing. In fact, Ina, she helped out over Peterson's over here. I think she was just a real young teenager, and she done the cooking for them once for some reason. The Petersons, two boys and one girl. They never married, so she'd go over there and help them out. Then later years, of course, after the steam engine, then it was the oil pull. And then finally came to the last tractor that I remember was an A. John Deere one of the neighbors had with his separator, so. And we used horses mostly for picking up the shocks, although some in the latter years used a tractor, but that wasn't near as handy because you'd have to jump up on that tractor every time you moved to another few shocks. So if you had horses, they almost knew where to go on their own. The good old days. Some weren't so good. I don't remember anything else that's really that exciting.
Felt like I had another question in there about threshing.
And if you hired out, you probably got $1 a day for working all day. That neighbor, widow lady, Emma Wold, and she had to be gone for something for a couple of days, so she hired me to take care of her place. So I went over there, I walked over there. It's a good half-mile walk. I'd go over there and milk her cows and feed her chickens and pick the eggs and feed the hogs and clean the barn. And my payment was 25 cents in the morning and 25 cents at night. Big bucks. Yeah.
Not a money-making venture.
Of course, you buy more for a quarter then than you could today, but not much. You could go to Long Prairie and go to Mickey's restaurant and get a hamburger for 15 cents. Or you could get a hot beef sandwich for 45 cents. Or an ice cream cone for a nickel. 2 scoops for a dime. And pop was probably a nickel. And that was the scarce thing. I remember Orville and Lorne once, they each bought a bottle of pop. We didn't have cans of pop at that time, bottle of pop. So I don't know, maybe they bought a couple and they were gonna, we didn't have refrigerators or cooler or anything like that. So they took a twine off the twine roll, tied it around the top of the bottle and then dropped it down into the open well we had. Well, they went back to get their pop, they pulled it up, and the twine had unwound and gone to the bottom of the well. Oh. Why do you remember such things? Yeah.
Did you guys, as a family, so you, Irene, Orville, Lorne, your mom and dad, did you guys go into town to go get ice cream, or I mean, what did you guys, what kind of things did you guys do as a
Maybe
family?
an ice cream cone, but and of course grocery stores aren't like they are today. We bought a lot of our groceries in Little Sock. You'd go in there with your grocery slip, and then you'd just read off your grocery slip, and he'd go and get whatever it was you needed and put it on the counter. And that's the way we got groceries. My dad would get our meat by butchering either a hog or a beef every fall, and then my mother would can the meat My aunt Ida would come over, my dad's sister, and she'd help Mom, and they'd cut the meat up, and they'd have to can it all because there was no refrigeration. Cut the beef into little chunks, and we always had food. We always raised chickens, we had eggs, and oftentimes if we were gonna have company, we'd grab a chicken and cut its head off, and I'd have the job of doing the cleaning. That happened many, many, many times. We'd get company from the cities. Of course, we didn't have indoor. Oh boy.